He joked she'd make a great bride. He had no idea who she actually was. She ran a company that could erase entire city blocks. She had no idea his shop was one of them. The company threatening to take his shop away had the same name on the business card in his drawer. 48 hours to decide whether an entire neighborhood was worth more than a spreadsheet. One joke in a fitting room. 1 year later, it wasn't a joke anymore.
Nobody tells you that the throwaway joke you make to a stranger on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon can end up being the exact sentence that changes the entire shape of your life, or that the woman laughing at your terrible joke about wedding dresses might, 6 weeks later, hold the legal power to shut down the small business your Javer spent 3 years quietly rebuilding. Daniel Foster made that joke on a slow Tuesday afternoon in March, standing in the fitting room alcove of Forever & Co. Bridal boutique, helping a stranger button the back of a sample gown she had no intention of buying, and said, without thinking too hard about it, "You know, you'd make a great bride." The woman, catching his eye in the mirror with an expression somewhere between amusement and challenge, had smiled and said, "I would need a groom for that." And Daniel had laughed and thought nothing more of it. The way you think nothing of most conversations with strangers who wander into a bridal shop for reasons that aren't actually about buying a dress. He had no idea that Tuesday afternoon that the woman he'd been joking with was Alexandra Wren, CEO of Wren Capital, the firm whose name was about to appear on a redevelopment notice taped to his shop's own front window 3 weeks later. If you've ever had a moment of easy, unguarded connection with a stranger turn out to matter more than either of you expected, stay with this story until the end, because what happens between Daniel and Alexandra over the following 2 months will make you believe a little more in the strange, complicated ways two people can find their way toward each other, even when the odds and the paperwork are stacked against them. And if this story resonates with you, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, because we bring you a new one just like it every single week, and we'd love to have you back. Daniel Foster had never planned on running a bridal boutique. He had spent most of his 20s as a high school woodworking and shop teacher, a job he genuinely loved, married to Rachel, a warm, quick-witted woman who ran Forever & Co. With her Aunt Marilyn, the two of them building the small shop's reputation over a decade into the kind of place brides across 3 counties specifically sought out for its unhurried, personal attention rather than the assembly line experience of the bigger chain stores. Daniel helped out on weekends when the shop got busy, mostly hauling boxes and fixing the ancient steamer that never quite worked right, until Rachel's sudden death from a pulmonary embolism 4 years ago, 8 months after their daughter Lily was born, left Daniel a widower with an infant, and a business he had never intended to run but couldn't bear to see Marilyn, herself pushing 70 and grieving her niece as fiercely as Daniel grieved his wife, try to manage alone. He had left teaching 2 years later, once it became clear that between Lily's daycare pickups and Marilyn's slowing pace, the shop needed someone present full-time, in a way neither of their existing arrangements could sustain, and had spent the 2 years since teaching himself the specific, unglamorous logistics of running a bridal boutique, alteration scheduling, vendor relationships with dress designers, the particular emotional labor of helping brides who arrived anxious and left, if he did his job right, feeling like the most beautiful version of themselves they'd ever seen in a mirror. The decision to leave teaching had not come easily, and Daniel still, on certain quiet mornings, missed the specific satisfaction of watching a student successfully cut their first dovetail joint after weeks of frustrated attempts. He remembered the exact conversation with his principal, a kind, patient woman named Dr. Alvarez, who had known Rachel personally and understood, better than most administrators might have, why a grieving father needed to walk away from a job he loved toward one that felt more like an obligation to the people who'd loved his wife. Marilyn had tried, in the early months after Rachel's death, to insist she could manage the shop alone, a claim Daniel had gently and repeatedly refused to accept. Watching her arrive later each week, her hands slower on the sewing machine she'd operated for 30 years, until the truth became impossible for either of them to keep avoiding. Forever & Co. needed Daniel as much as Daniel, in his own complicated grief. needed somewhere steady to put his hands and his attention that wasn't simply an empty house with a crib he couldn't bring himself to move out of the nursery. He was good at it in a way that surprised him. The same patient, unhurried attentiveness that had saved him made him a decent shop teacher, translating easily into a decent bridal consultant. Though he rarely called himself that out loud, still privately thinking of himself as a woodworking teacher who happened to also know an unreasonable amount about bustle styles and dress preservation. Alexandra Wren had walked into Forever & Co. on that particular Tuesday afternoon, not to shop for herself, but to return a bridesmaid dress on C's behalf of her assistant sister, a favor she'd insist. After overhearing her assistant stress about the boutique's narrow return window during a week, neither of them had time to spare. Alexandra was 36, the CEO of Wren Capital, a real estate investment firm she'd built over 12 relentless years, from a modest seed fund into a company managing several billions of dollars in commercial redevelopment projects across the region, a career that had consumed nearly every waking hour of her adult life, and left her, by her own private assessment, considerably better at negotiating leverage than at anything resembling an actual personal life. She had agreed to make the return herself, partly out of genuine kindness, and partly, she admitted to herself in the car on the way over, because 90 minutes away from back-to-back acquisition meetings sounded, that particular Tuesday, like the closest thing to a vacation her calendar was going to offer her that month. Daniel had been mid-alteration fitting with another customer when Alexandra walked in, and Marilyn, occupied at the register, had asked Alexandra, apologetically, whether she'd mind waiting a few minutes near the fitting alcove while they finished. Alexandra, mildly amused at finding herself standing in a room full of tulle and lace in her sharpest business blazer, had wandered toward a sample gown displayed on a mannequin near the mirror, examining the beadwork with the specific, appraising attention she brought to evaluating any piece of craftsmanship, business-related or not. Daniel, finishing his fitting and noticing her interest in the gown, had asked, half in passing, whether she wanted to see how it actually looked on, rather than just examining it on the mannequin, and Alexandra, surprising herself, had said yes. It was while he was fastening the back buttons, the two of them making the easy, low-stakes small scene talk of two strangers who both understood nothing serious was actually happening, that Daniel had made the joke, and Alexandra, catching his eye in the mirror, had delivered her reply with a dry, confident timing that made Daniel laugh out loud for the raving. Though for the first time in what felt like a genuinely long stretch of ordinary Tuesdays. They talked for another 10 minutes, while she changed back into her own clothes. Alexandra deliberately vague about what exactly she did for work, Daniel telling her, without much thought about who might be listening, about Lily, about Rachel, about the specific, patchwork path that had led a former shop teacher into running a bridal boutique he'd never planned on inheriting. Alexandra left with her assistant's sister's dress, successfully returned, and a business card Daniel had pressed into her hand somewhat impulsively, telling her, if she or anyone she knew ever needed a dress, to ask for him specifically. She did not expect, driving back to her office, to spend an unreasonable amount of that afternoon's board meeting thinking about a shop teacher's laugh, instead of the acquisition terms in front of her. The collision, when it came 3 weeks later, arrived with the specific, dull inevitability of paperwork rather than any dramatic confrontation. Wren Capital had spent the better part of a year quietly assembling a redevelopment package for the 6-block commercial corridor that included Forever & Co. A project Alexandra had inherited from her firm's acquisitions team, rather than personally originated. One of dozens of similar projects moving through Wren Capital's pipeline at any given time, each one reduced, at the executive level, to a folder of projected returns and zoning variances rather than a list of the actual small businesses whose leases sat inside the redevelopment footprint. Alexandra had approved the corridor's inclusion in the firm's quarterly acquisition targets months before ever setting foot in Forever & Co., without ever cross-referencing the specific addresses against anything as granular as a business she'd personally visited. An oversight that would have seemed unremarkable in any other week of her career, and now, in retrospect, Felt like exactly the kind of institutional blindness she'd spent years telling herself her firm didn't practice. Daniel found out the same way most of the corridor's small business owners did, through a notice taped discreetly to the shop's front window on a Thursday morning, informing tenants that the property had entered a redevelopment review process under Ren Capital Holdings, with lease renewal terms subject to change pending the review's outcome. He read the notice twice, standing on the sidewalk in his work apron, before the name Ren Capital connected, with a slow, sinking recognition, to the business card he'd tucked into his shop's front desk drawer 3 weeks earlier, the one he'd been telling himself he might actually call the number on, just to see whether the easy Tuesday afternoon conversation had meant anything at all. He called the number anyway, that same afternoon, though the conversation he'd imagined having was considerably different from the one that actually happened. Alexandra answered on the second ring, recognizing his voice immediately, and Daniel, without much preamble, told her plainly that Ren Capital's name was now taped to his shop's front window, and asked her, directly, whether she had known that when she walked into Forever & Co. 3 weeks earlier. The honest answer, which Alexandra gave him without hedging, was that she hadn't known, that the acquisition had moved through her firm's pipeline as a routine corridor redevelopment months before her personal visit, and that she was, in that exact moment on the phone, pulling up the project file for the first time, specifically to confirm what Daniel had just told her. The silence that followed, on both ends of the call, carried a specific, complicated weight neither of them had expected an ordinary Thursday afternoon to hold. Daniel told her, with more restraint than he actually felt, that he understood businesses got redeveloped, that this wasn't personal, but that it was hard not to feel a particular kind of foolish, having spent the past 3 weeks half hoping a stranger's business card might turn into something, only to discover the stranger's company was the one that might end up taking his shop away entirely. Alexandra, listening, found herself doing something she rarely did in the middle of an active acquisition. She asked him to give her 48 hours before assuming anything about the corridor's outcome, not as a corporate reassurance designed to placate an anxious tenant, but because she genuinely did not yet know what she was going to do, and she was not willing to make him a promise she couldn't actually keep. Those 48 hours were, by Alexandra's own later admission, some of the most uncomfortable of her professional career. Not because the redevelopment numbers were unusually complicated, but because she found herself, for the first time in 12 years of relentless acquisitions, actually walking the corridor block by block, talking directly to the business owners whose leases sat inside a project she'd previously only encountered as a spreadsheet. She started at the corner farthest from Forever & Co., deliberately, telling herself she wanted an honest read on the corridor rather than one. Shaped by her own complicated feelings about the bridal shop specifically, and spent nearly 6 hours across 2 days doing something she realized, with some discomfort, she had never once done in 12 years of approving similar projects. Sitting down, uninvited, and without any announcement of her actual position, in the back office of a family-owned print shop, a 100-year-old locksmith counter, a Salvadoran bakery whose owner had immigrated specifically to open it, and simply asking each owner what the block meant to them, what they'd built, and what losing to her lease would actually cost beyond the number on a relocation assistance line item. She met the owner of the tailor shop 2 doors down from Forever & Co., a man who'd been altering suits on that corner for 31 years, and the sisters, who ran the corridor's only independent bookstore, and Marilyn, who told Alexandra, with the blunt directness of a woman who had buried her niece and had very little patience left for corporate euphemism, exactly what the shop meant to the brides who'd walked through its doors for a decade, and exactly what it would mean to Daniel and Lily if it disappeared into a redevelopment plan that treated the entire block as a single line of projected square footage. By the end of the second day, sitting alone in her car outside the corridor's last storefront, Alexandra found herself doing math she had never once run in 12 years of acquisitions. Not projected returns or cap rates, but the simple, ordinary arithmetic of how many decades of accumulated relationships, trust, and neighborhood memory her firm's spreadsheet had reduced to a single redevelopment timeline, and how casually she had approved that timeline without ever once considering that math mattered as much as the other kind. Alexandra returned to Ren Capital's offices on the third day and did something her acquisitions team had not seen her do in the firm's 12-year history. She pulled the 6-block corridor entirely out of the quarter's active redevelopment pipeline, not with a quiet internal memo, but in a full team meeting, explaining, without naming Daniel or Forever & Co., specifically, that she had spent 48 hours actually meeting the businesses inside a project her team had been evaluating purely on projected returns, and that she was no longer uncomfortable approving redevelopment decisions at a remove that let her firm treat entire neighborhoods as abstractions. Her head of acquisitions, a sharp, numbers-driven man named Charles Okonjo, who had worked alongside Alexandra for 8 years, pushed back hard, arguing that the corridor represented one of the firm's strongest projected return opportunities that quarter, and that pulling it without a clearly articulated business rationale would raise uncomfortable questions from the firm's own investors. Alexandra, to Charles's evident surprise, did not attempt to hide behind a manufactured business justification. She told him plainly that she'd found a rationale she considered legitimate, that Ren Capital's diligence process needed a mandatory small business impact review before any future corridor redevelopment moved forward, whatever the short-term cost to that quarter's numbers, and that if the investors had questions, she would answer them personally. She called Daniel herself that same evening, not through any assistant or formal notice, and told him directly that the corridor redevelopment had been pulled, that Forever & Co.'s lease was safe under its existing terms, and that she was implementing a policy change at Ren Capital that would require actual, documented engagement with small businesses before any future project moved forward. A policy that existed, she told him honestly, because of the specific, uncomfortable clarity his phone call had forced her to sit with. Daniel, listening, found himself less interested, in that moment, in the business outcome, than in the fact that she had called him herself, rather than routing the news through paperwork. A small, deliberate choice that told him more about who she actually was than anything from their easy Tuesday afternoon conversation 3 weeks earlier. "I owe you an actual apology," Alexandra said. "Not just a policy change. I should have cross-referenced the corridor addresses the moment I remembered where I'd been 3 weeks earlier. And I didn't, because it genuinely did not occur to me. And that's exactly the problem I'm now trying to fix," Daniel told her, with the particular honesty he brought to most difficult conversations, that he appreciated the apology, but that what had actually stung, more than the redevelopment notice itself, was the specific fear that the easy connection they'd had in the fitting room had been, in retrospect, just another version of a stranger passing through his shop without any real weight behind it. And Alexandra, absorbing this, told him that the connection had weighed on her considerably more than she'd let herself admit over the past 3 weeks. Enough that she'd caught herself, more than once, drafting a text to the number on his business card and deleting it before sending, uncertain whether reaching out was appropriate, given what her own firm's paperwork was about to do to his shop. What followed was not an instant, uncomplicated romance, because the professional entanglement of the redevelopment decision, even resolved in Daniel's favor, left both of them navigating a specific, unusual caution neither wanted to rush past too quickly. Alexandra insisted, once she'd pulled the corridor from active redevelopment, on formally recusing herself from any future Ren Capital business involving that block, a form paperwork technicality she considered non-negotiable before she was willing to see Daniel outside the context of the shop at all, telling him plainly that she needed there to be zero ambiguity about whether anything between them could ever be mistaken for a business relationship. Daniel, for his part, needed time to trust that her interest in him wasn't Pillway seized by guilt over the redevelopment scare, a caution Alexandra respected without pushing against, understanding that the specific vulnerability of dating someone whose company had briefly threatened his livelihood required more patience than a typical new relationship. Their actual first date 6 weeks after the fitting room conversation, and 2 weeks after the corridor's redevelopment status was formally and permanently resolved, was deliberately unglamorous. A Tuesday afternoon coffee at a shop 2 blocks from Forever & Co. Chosen specifically because it was ordinary enough that neither of them could mistake it for anything performative. Alexandra met Lily for the first time a month later, a meeting Daniel had been more nervous about than he let on, and found, to his quiet relief, that his daughter took an immediate, uncomplicated liking to the sharp-eyed woman who asked her serious, genuinely curious questions about her extensive collection of rocks, rather than the reflexive, condescending questions most adults defaulted to with a 7-year-old. The meeting happened at Daniel's careful engineering, at the shop, rather than anywhere that might feel more loaded with expectation. Lily arriving, after school with her backpack still on, to find Alexandra crouched on the floor, examining a rock Lily had specifically brought to show her, a speckled gray stone, Lily insisted, with total 7-year-old conviction, contained a fossil visible only under exactly the right light. Alexandra, rather than offering the polite, distracted validation most adults gave the claim, actually turned the rock over several times, asked Lily precisely what kind of fossil she suspected and why, and then admitted, with a seriousness that delighted Lily far more than easy agreement would have, that she genuinely didn't know enough about fossils to confirm or deny the theory, but thought they should look it up together. Daniel, watching from behind the counter, felt something in his chest loosen that he hadn't but fully realized he'd been holding tight for months, the specific, cautious hope of a father who needed his daughter's reaction to matter more than his own. The relationship that developed over the following months was built deliberately on the same unhurried attentiveness that had made Daniel good at his job and, it turned out, made Alexandra considerably better at her own once she started actually practicing it outside the fourth room where she'd first stumbled into it. She began, gradually, reshaping Wren Capital's acquisitions process beyond the single policy change she'd announced in that first team meeting, building out an entire small business preservation division that Charles Okonjo, once the loudest skeptic in the room, eventually came to run himself, having discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that projects designed around genuine community engagement performed better over a longer investment horizon than the firm's older, purely extraction-focused model had ever managed. Daniel, in turn, found himself drawn slowly back toward a version of teaching he'd genuinely missed, starting a small evening workshop at Forever & Co. on basic dress alteration and preservation techniques for brides who wanted to understand more about the garments they were investing in. A modest addition to the shop's offerings that Marilyn, delighted, insisted on calling Daniel's Tuesday classes, regardless of what day they were actually scheduled. Alexandra attended one, early on, ostensibly out of curiosity and transparently, to anyone watching, because she wanted an excuse to watch Daniel do the specific, patient work that had first caught her attention in a fitting room mirror 3 weeks before either of them had any idea how complicated their story was about to become. Marilyn, watching the two of them from behind the shop register some 8 months after that first Tuesday afternoon, remarked to Daniel, not for the first time, that she'd always believed Rachel would have liked Alexandra, a comment Daniel received with the particular, complicated gratitude of a widower who had learned, slowly, that loving someone new did not require erasing what had come before it, only building carefully alongside it. Lily, for her part, had taken to introducing Alexandra to her school friends with a matter-of-fact confidence that suggested the relationship had settled, in her 7-year-old understanding of the world, into something she no longer needed to explain or justify, simply a fact of her life, the way the shop and her rock collection and her father's terrible jokes were facts of her life. Daniel proposed on a Tuesday, deliberately, in the same fitting room alcove where the entire story had started, Marilyn having cleared the shop of customers for a suspiciously specific hour, under the pretense of inventory, Lily standing beside him, holding a small velvet box she'd been sworn to secrecy about for 2 full weeks. An achievement Daniel considered nearly as impressive as the proposal itself. He did not make a joke this time, though Alexandra, laughing through tears as she said yes, told him afterward that some small part of her had been braced for him to ask whether she's self, with whether she finally reconsider being a bride. And Daniel, grinning, admitted that he had, in fact, written that exact line into 3 separate drafts of what he planned to say before deciding the sinking freeze to their first terrible joke. What Alexandra Wren ultimately came to understand, standing in the same fitting room alcove, 8 months after nearly signing off on a redevelopment plan that would have erased it entirely, is that the specific kind of leverage she had spent 12 years mastering, the ability to see an entire city block reduced to projected returns on a spreadsheet, had never actually made her powerful in any way that mattered as much as the ordinary, unglamorous attentiveness Daniel brought to buttoning the back of a stranger's coarse dress on a slow Tuesday afternoon, genuinely present with whoever happened to be in front of him rather than calculating what they represented. If there is one thing this story asks you to carry with you, it is this. Sometimes the biggest decisions in our lives arrive disguised as small throwaway moments. An offhand joke in a fitting room, a business card pressed into a stranger's hand on impulse. And the only way to find out which small moments were actually enormous is to stay present enough in each one to actually notice when they are. They married the following autumn, in the corridor itself, closing off the block for a single Saturday afternoon, with the enthusiastic cooperation of nearly every business owner. Alexandra had spent those uncomfortable 48 hours meeting the year before, the tailor 2 doors down, insisting on personally hemming Daniel's suit trousers at no charge, the bakery providing the wedding cake, Marilyn overseeing the alterations on a gown Alexandra had chosen, fittingly, from Forever & Co. His own collection, fitted not by Daniel this time, but by Marilyn herself, who told Alexandra, pinning the final hem, that she'd been waiting a very long time to dress a bride she actually got to watch fall in love from the very beginning. Lily served as flower girl, taking the responsibility with the same grave seriousness she brought to her rock collection, and insisted on carrying, alongside her basket of petals, the speckled gray stone that had started her friendship with Alexandra, tucked into a small, velvet pouch Daniel had specially made for the occasion in his old woodworking shop. The first project he'd built with his hands in years, purely because he wanted to, rather than because the shop needed fixing. Charles Okonjo, who had by then taken over Wren Capital's small business preservation division entirely, stood near the back of the crowd during the ceremony and told Alexandra afterward, with the dry understatement of a man who had once argued fiercely against pulling the corridor's Redevelopment, that watching an entire block shut down its Saturday business to celebrate, her wedding had taught him more about long-term investment value than any quarterly report the firm had produced in his 8 years there. Alexandra, dancing with Daniel later that evening in the middle of a street that had nearly been demolished under her own signature, thought about the specific, ordinary Tuesday that had started everything. A joke about a bride and a groom exchanged between 2 strangers who had no idea, in that fitting room mirror, exactly how much weight that small, unguarded moment was eventually going to carry.